my pleasure to welcome you back to the third and final speaker of this morning's panel. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Agatha Bielik-Robson, who comes to us from the University of Nottingham, where she is Professor for Jewish Studies, and among her publications, most recently, a book entitled Jewish Chronologies of Late Modernity. And she will speak to us this morning, present a paper entitled Love Strong as Death, Jews Against Hitler.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to Raphael and Joseph. I'm not going to talk much about Heidegger, especially the Schwarze Hefte. I'm rather going to give voice to those people, the Jewish people who were forever excluded from Heidegger's high philosophical discourse. So the title is indeed Love Strong as Death, Jews Against Heidegger. In his critique of Heidegger in Difficult Freedom, Levinas complains that in his death-dominated and death-oriented thought, there is no place for being with the other. Sein zum Tode, being unto death, is a solitary enterprise, and the only Mit-Sein, being with, which Heidegger envisages, in the end boils down, as Levinas maliciously remarks, to mitmarschieren, marching with, an army of isolated designs exercising their authenticity in the totally mobilized Todesbereitschaft, readiness for death. Levinas is not the first and not the only Jewish philosopher who uttered his objection to Heidegger's overestimation of death by drawing out of the sources of Judaism. In fact, there is a whole secret alliance of thinkers, more or less explicitly inspired by this alternative tradition, which can be opposed to what Harold Bloom, himself a member of this group, called somewhat derisively Heidegger and his French flock. Despite all the differences between them, Franz Rosenzweig, provided we don't read him through the Heideggerizing lenses of Karl Löwit, Hannah Arendt, Emanuel Levinas and Harold Bloom form an unofficial coalition of thinkers firmly opposed to the Heideggerian mode of doing philosophy solely under the auspices of death. There is also one further feature which they share, the importance of the intellectual heritage of the Song of Songs. Rosenzweig bases the whole second part of the Star of Redemption devoted to revelation on the grammar of the Song of Songs. Arendt takes from it her nativistic conception of love. Bloom, by fusing it with Shakespeare's sonnets, turns the song into a dramatic canvas of his poetic love-hate relationship between the precursor and the effete. While Levinas borrows from the song the notion of radical asymmetry between the subject and the other. In all these approaches, Shir Hashirim, famous love as strong as death, Azak, Amavet, Ahava, lends itself to the philosophical speculation which offers a different conception of the finite existence, destined to die, but by no means exhausted by its lethal destiny. Determined to resist the final verdict, again an intense life before death, marked by passionate relations with others. While, as Rosenzweig claims, the whole Western philosophical thought from Ionia to Jena and beyond is incurably infected with the thanatic, even thanatophilic tendency, which perceives human finitude only through death, the Hebrew thought offers a striking alternative which substitutes love for death and makes it equally strong. Let me begin with Rosenzweig, who was never properly exposed to Heidegger's own thought, but who nonetheless reacted to the general thanatic climate of his epoch by trying to resist it. Rosenzweig's main question, especially in his later period, is it possible at all to think about our finitude differently, not under the auspices of death, the end, the goal, the final destiny, the ultimate verdict? The whole stake of Rosenzweig's Neues Denken is to venture precisely such an endeavor, to try to think finitude positively. Although often seen as a parallel to Heidegger's analytics of design, Rosenzweig's new thinking is actually the very opposite. Despite many deceptively similar formulations which also portray life as issuing towards death, it is uniquely concerned with the question that never much bothered Heidegger, namely, is life before death possible? The seeming paradox, therefore, consists in the defense of life as finite and as life, not the shadow of death, which informs and paralyzes the vital forces at the moment of their inception, but a full, healthy life, which simultaneously affirms itself as a separate category and recognizes sovereignty of death. The little book of Rosenzweig, called Understanding the Sick and the Healthy, endeavors to teach life the lesson of maintaining itself in the paradox without solving or sublating it. I quote, "By teaching man to live again, we have taught him to move towards death. We have taught him to live, though each step he takes brings him closer to death. There is no remedy for death, not even health. A healthy man, however, has the strength to continue towards the grave. The sick man invokes death and lets himself be carried away in mortal fear. In health, even death comes at the proper time." All appearances to the contrary, this is not Heidegger's Sein zum Tode. The little yet decisive difference lies in the emphasis Rosenzweig puts on the active resistance of life against death's chilling influence, on the way the healthy subject moves or continues towards death, despite the constant danger of the paralysis of artificial death, or the death in life, which stops him from moving on. Despite death's declared sovereignty, the life, which eventually succumbs to death, is not to learn anything from his absolute master. It is accept its overruling presence, but not to allow itself to be overwhelmed by it. Accept the verdict, but not the authority. Take on the sentence, but not the wisdom which underlies. That may thus be an end, even goal, but it is pictured here as the limit, which is not invited to the center of life, inmitten des Lebens, but delegated as a sinister power outside, only to intervene in its own proper time. Whereas in Heidegger's original construction of being towards death, death penetrates into the very midst of design. It is the very motor of its self-transcending existence, the teacher of the heroic decision-making, which is as groundless, abyssal, and pervaded by nothingness as death itself. Here, death is indeed a telos of life, which runs its course according to this lofty submission, or as Jean-Luc Nancy calls it aptly, sublime self-offering. Death is let in the middle of life as its thanatic guide, either in the existential function of a catalyst, heroic decision, or, after the Heidegger's Kehre, as the demobilizing event horizon which works through die Gelassenheit, the quietistic anti-force of appeasement. None of it figures in Rosenzweig's project of new thinking, which wants to give death its proper due, but absolutely nothing more. It wants to acknowledge the fact of the finite life without overestimating death's impact on the process of living. Finding the right measure, the right ratio in death's relationship with life is the sole purpose here, which makes Rosenzweig's endeavor opposite to Heidegger's one, which from the perspective of Neues Denken may indeed be characterized as a systematic overestimation of death. In the series of lectures composed in 1935 and then edited under the title Introduction to Metaphysics, Heidegger presents death as the ultimate aporia, drawing on the original Greek meaning of the word as a no way out, no exit, the unsurpassable blocking of the passage. Man who likes to see himself as pantoporos, that is the most resourceful creature which begets in itself its own unessence, the versatility, Vielwendigkeit of many twists and turns, deep down appears to be, in fact, aporos, a priorly blocked and thwarted. Now the longer quote. There is only one thing against which all violence doing directly shutters, that is death. It is an end beyond all completion, a limit beyond all limits. Here there is no breaking forth and breaking up, no capturing and subjugating. But this uncanny thing which sets us simply and suddenly out from everything homely once and for all is not a special event that must also be mentioned among others, because it too ultimately does occur. The human being has no way out in the face of death, not only when it is time to die, but constantly and essentially. Insofar as humans are, they stand in the no exit of death. For Rosenzweig, just like for Heidegger, human life is with no pre-established essence. The latter, in the Introduction to Metaphysics, states firmly that the determination of the essence of the human being is never an answer, but is essentially a question. Yet the two thinkers played out very differently. Heidegger nolens volens gravitates towards the closure, the death assuredness of death, which substitutes for the missing essence of the design. Seinsdenken and Todesdenken become in the end undistinguishable synonyms. It is after all death which steers away man from the familiar homeliness of the world of seeming and throws him into the nearness of being, the most uncanny, unheimlich of all thought. It is the annihilating Nichten, the power of death, which puts man in touch with the Nichts des Seins, the nothingness of being, which underlies the realm of being. Death, therefore, becomes the vehicle of the highest spiritual transport, which defines the destiny of human design. A diagnosis not very far, in fact, from the original Thanatic thought of Hegel, who in the preface to Phenomenology of Spirit depicts spirit as the power capable to abide in death and to look it straight in the face. I quote again, the human being has no way out in the face of death, not only when it is time to die, but constantly and essentially. This, for Rosenzweig, is precisely the sickness unto death, which pushes that into the very center of human life as its defining moment, giving it constancy and essence. In Heidegger, no being, no positive content can ever fill the gap of nothingness which constitutes human being, and thus offer an answer to its glaring, questioning abyss. This Nichts can only be matched by the Nichts of death, which helps to disclose the abyssal Nichts of being. Rosenzweig's intention is precisely to counteract the mastery of this deadly triad, which turns the ordinary unessence of human life into a hypostatized, sublime nothing. In order to avoid this hypostasis, the life must agree to be the thing of unessence, a flow without form, a meandering story with many twists and turns. Again, a life which is content to be an in-between state, merely a transition from one thing to another. Here we are immediately reminded that in the Star of Redemption, the seemingly derogatory characteristic, transition from one thing to another, was actually given to what Rosenzweig regards as the highest and most valuable content of the revelation, that is, love. For it is love which goes from one neighbor to another and paces restlessly the whole world in the constant transition, oblivious to its own essence, and not at all interested in the centering self-reflection. It is love which, in Goethe's words, which Rosenzweig quotes, connects all without creating a hypostatic Allheit, totality, itself indefinite, and because of that infinitely open to embrace each being, one after another, nominally and nominalistically, just like God himself, who knows every creature by name as a unique singularity. For Rosenzweig, therefore, the life in transition, life in between, does not indicate dispersion, impurity, or incompleteness, as it does for Heidegger. It is inessential, so it can fill itself with intense neighborly relations. It is lacking essence, so it can be full of love. As Jean-Luc Nancy puts it in his Finite Thinking, in the fragment strongly inspired by Rosenzweig, I quote, "Love cuts across finitude, always from the other to the other, which never returns to the same. And all loves, so humbly alike, are superbly singular. Love offers finitude in its truth. It is finitude's dazzling presentation." We could thus sum up the difference between Rosenzweig and Heidegger by evoking the biblical line, which is also the guiding motif of the star, "Azach hamavet ahava," love strong as death. The vital, incomplete, exposed indefinity of love versus the definitive closure sealed by the verdict of death. Both these visions of life are finite, but while the Heideggerian one overestimates the defining moment of the ending as constant and essential, the Rosenzweigian one evades it as merely secondary, because he's not looking for any definition of human life. Agreeing that human life must remain a thing of unessence, he rather goes for love, which thrives on everything non-essential, strictly singular, transitory, non-identitarian, exposed. Here, human being is not a death-bound nothing, collapsing into his inner nothingness, but a lively bundle of energy, which easily flows into the energies of the world. Love turns the negativity of unessence into positivity of intense singular relation. This is what Rosenzweig calls the Umkehr, the turn, but also, more theologically, conversion. There is no love in philosophy. In Hegel, Rosenzweig's main adversary, as well as in Heidegger, the later enemy of Levinas, human finite life is spanned under the solitary auspices of death. There is seemingly a lot of love in Christianity, but a closer look at it betrays that the Christian love, as we know it from Augustine, remains in the service of death. Whether by ecstasy or by ascesis, the Christian soul reaches its goal in either self-dissolution or self-mortification. This is the context, as well as the main theme of Hannah Arendt's doctoral dissertation, Augustine's Liebesbegriff on the concept of love in St. Augustine, written in the 20s under Martin Heidegger's supervision. The first part of Arendt's dissertation is devoted to the critique of Augustine's idea of love, which, in her interpretation, turns out to be a thanatos in disguise. It is hard not to see that this is in fact a veiled critique of Heidegger himself. Arendt shows how Augustine, caught in the terminological net of Neoplatonic thought, which defines love as craving, appetitus, runs into trouble with his account of the concept coming from a different tradition, the neighborly love, caritas. Augustine's thinking is thus wholly inscribed into the Platonic craving for the eternal and the infinite, which completely disregards the finite dimension of the creaturely life. For him, I quote Arendt, life on earth is a living death, mors vitalis or vita mortalis. It is altogether determined by death. Indeed, it is more properly called death. But then she also detects another stream of thought in Augustine, less Greek, more Paulian, which connects love not with the Platonic lack of being and craving, but with the fullness of being, as given by the Maker in the moment of man's birth. Arendt says, the decisive fact determining man as a conscious, remembering being is birth or natality. That is, the fact that we have entered the world through birth. The decisive fact determining man as a desiring being was death and mortality. The fact that we shall leave the world in death. Fear of death and inadequacy of life are the springs of desire. In contrast, gratitude for life, having been given an all, is the spring of remembrance, for a life is cherished even in misery. What ultimately steals the fear of death is not hope or desire, but remembrance and gratitude. Give thanks for wanting to be as you are, that you may be delivered from an existence that you do not want. For you are willing to be and unwilling to be miserable. This will to be under all circumstances is the hallmark of man's attachment to the transmundane source of his existence. It is precisely in this context that Augustine draws his distinction between principium and initium, the beginning of the world and time, and the beginning of man. Arendt quotes the famous fragment from the City of God, that the beginning be made, man was created. Whereas principium grants the universe in the manner of the Greek arche, that is, as the first arch principle of perpetual order of being, initium allows for a creative disruption of the cosmic monotony, into which there suddenly enters a novitas, something radically new. But what is the role of remembrance and gratitude as opposed to hope and desire? Arendt attempts an alternative anthropology of human finitude, based not so much on the Heideggerian thanatic recognition of one's inevitable end in death, as on the biophilic, life-loving recognition of one's beginning in birth, here understood as the gift of life. The finite being does not have to think about itself as running towards its death. It can also think about its moment of springing into being, its whence, where it was bestowed with life, and revert the sequence of expectation by substituting the beginning for the end, or, in other words, by eliminating the obsessive thinking of death and replacing it with the contemplation of one's origin. The Augustinian man says, I want to return where I came from. In my beginning is my proper end, the promised fullness of life. Remembrance and gratitude, therefore, are not strictly opposed to hope and desire. Rather, they engender their own structure of hope and desire, this time not driven by the recognition of death, but by the wish to cherish the original gift of life, to intensify it, to hope for more life, Lahaim, yet to come. Arendt. Since our expectations and desires are prompted by what we remember and guided by a previous knowledge, it is memory and not expectation, for instance, the expectation of that as in Heidegger's approach, that gives unity and wholeness to human existence. Only man, but no other mortal being, lives towards his ultimate origin, while living toward the final boundary of death. By virtue of man's quest for his own being, the beginning and end of his life become exchangeable. It is this fundamental reversal which makes human finite existence truly human. Arendt's notion of exchangeability between the beginning and the end structurally resembles the Rosenzweigian Umkehr, where love, given by the Maker, replaces death, sealing the creaturely existence with the heavy mark of mortality. Given the fact that Arendt knew the Star of Redemption at the time when she wrote about Augustine, her natalism may in fact be derivative from Rosenzweig's existential lesson on conversion. We will find some later variants of this reversal in other thinkers inspired by the Jewish heritage. In Levinas, it is precisely this reversed temporality which creates a countercurrent against death, a human life as Zeigen Gegentode. Instead of running straight towards its end, the human life creates an eddy, as Levinas calls it in Infinity and Totality, an eddy or an interiority in the stream of time, which resists the flow of transience. And by reaching freely towards its origins in memory, it separates itself from being's general participation in the flux, thus making itself free. Poising himself against Heidegger even more explicitly, Harold Bloom argues that the poetic life, which for him serves as the intensified pars pro toto of human life as such, is structured according to the rhetorical trope of metalepsis, or the reversal, the substitution of an origin for an end, which allows for the emancipation of a creative impulse from the thanatic repetition of more of the same. Only when cause and effect are metaleptically reversed, and the poetic self, instead of going with the flow unto death, works stubbornly towards his own origins, a new creation can happen at all. Only when the poet dwells within and elaborates on the powers of origination can he hope to become truly original, not just a copy or replica of what was before. The Arendtian, Levinasian, Bloomian focus on the origin is thus the necessary precondition of freedom and creativity, which in Nietzsche's words rebels against the times it was, that is, against the times empty accumulation and repetition. This is where, as it seems, Hegel, Heidegger, and Kojève, mentioned yesterday by Sloterdijk, got it wrong. It is not just the consciousness of death which acts as an anthropogenic factor, which makes human being truly human. A mere consciousness of that only adds a reflexive dimension to the animal way of living, which inevitably ends with dying, as indeed in Hegel's description of the master, who once challenged death fully consciously, but then leads an idle life of a pure-blooded, stupefied beast. What truly constitutes the anthropogenic moment is the reversal of temporality, which ignores the end for the sake of the doubled origin, the renewal of the gift of being. For Paul and Augustine, due to this reversal renewal, death as such completely dissolves by showing its true face of a rebirth into a truly eternal way of living. But this is only an extreme Christian version of the anthropogenic reversal, which goes as far as to annul altogether the initial condition of finitude. By turning death simply into a new birth, this time giving life eternal and infinite, the Christian impatient heart, as Rosenzweig called it, evacuates itself from the realm of creatureness, inescapably marked with death. What Arendt, but also Rosenzweig, Levinas, and Bloom have in mind is more modest and more in harmony with the finite being. The reversal does not prolong the moment of natality ad infinitum, of offering a birth without death and life without loss, but complicates the temporality of human finite existence by giving it an non-natural or reverse causa finalis. It lets human origin shine on and organize the whole of life by deprivileging the natural end. Contrary to the thanatic condition, which indeed overestimates death as the organizing and defining goal, center, final cause of human life, this vision of finitude, focused on natality, ignores the natural end by replacing it with the counter rhythm of a constant renewal, working on and through the original gift of life. To focus on the origin rather than the end not only denaturalizes human existence, which is not an all bad thing, but also makes it open to the presence of others, inherent in the moment of origin, versus the absence of others, obliterated in the solitary moment of dying, so often emphasized and extolled by Heidegger. The focus on the beginning of human life rather than on its end brings in the original heterogeny of a human existence, the constant company of others who gave me life and sustained its precarious growth through their love. The company summarized in the ideal image of the Augustinian God who made me. Seen from the perspective of its beginning, the finite human life is immediately dialogic, exposed to intense relations, neighborly love included. While seen from the perspective of its natural end, it sinks into the soliloquy of death, always too gemeinig and einzig almost to be shared. This is Arendt's major piece de résistance against Heidegger's influence, a resistance demonstrating an effective elective affinity with the one offered first half unknowingly by Rosenzweig and then already fully deliberately by Levinas and Bloom. The new affirmation of finite life, which can be put collectively under the Rosenzweigian heading of new thinking, takes roots indeed in the anti-Heideggerian impulse, which manages to mobilize latent reserves of alternative vitalistic traditions, among which the Jewish heritage with its imperative choose life is certainly not to be ignored. Far from being obedient Heidegger's children, Rosenzweig, Arendt, and Bloom offer instead a promise of a different thinking, which is not fated with the Heideggerian Thanatic closure, and as such still full of an unexplored future potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thoughtful and reflective paper, and we have time for questions and comments.
Zionism, and it seems, and she appreciates, but critiques Levinas on the basis of his exclusion of the Palestinian from the company of the other. So, in that sense, is Levinas Heidegger malgré lui, in the sense of the previous discourse, of the previous person's discourse?
Levinas' position is very tricky in this mapping. And I only mentioned him at the beginning when he utters this very well-known cliché, right, of his critique of Heidegger, that living together in Heidegger is only Mitmarschieren, which I think Brian very nicely deconstructed in his paper. I rather focused on Rosenzweig, Arendt, and Bloom, and mentioned Levinas only once when he makes his more serious anti-Heideggerian foray in infinity and totality, when he talks explicitly as life being Gegentode. But Butler is right, and Butler is Arendtian, right? The whole concept of the precarious life, the focus on natality.
For Butler, it's inconsistency, just for the previous speaker.
Her take on biopolitics and so on, it's very much Arendt and Rosenzweig inspired. Okay. And I would agree with her, actually, that there is a problem with Levinas, who is actually far too Heideggerian in his overestimation of death, especially in his later period, that is in Otherwise Than Being, where the whole idea of the a little substitution, right, that the true act of the neighborly love is actually to be able to substitute yourself for your neighbor and die instead of him, is, although it is meant as a polemic of Heidegger, takes on board too much of Heideggerian Thanatic premises, once again making death a kind of a defining center of human life. And that's precisely what I was trying to avoid. So I don't know if it answers your question, but from my position, right, Levinas is a bit tangential. Right? I don't, sometimes he fits, sometimes he does not, right, to this whole picture.
Thank you very much for your paper, and I have one question concerning both Rosenzweig and Hannah Arendt. I think not only the insistence you made on birth and life is essential, it's always a complete different understanding of the community, and I would like to hear more about that. There is especially in the third part and of the Star of Redemption and life in eternity, and the way of seeing the Jewish festivals, and tends towards a completely different understanding of community. And I think this is not only a reversal to birth, but also and also Arendt, especially maybe in her later writing, has a completely understanding of the place as being informed actually by the political community. And here again, I think both Rosenzweig and Hannah Arendt echoes two forms of community: the Jewish community on one side, and the political community giving emancipation to the Jews in German Reich, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, when it comes to political or social thinking, Rosenzweig and Arendt are very different and very opposite. So I deliberately ignored the third part of the Star of Redemption, which is my least favorite part, and I think that is completely contradictory. If you read the first and the second part of the Star, that's enough. And in a way, he should never have written the third, because it, in a way, completely undermines what he says about the indefinite, essential openness of the neighborly love in the second part. Because, and which is actually taken on by Arendt in her critique of Augustine, where she argues that Augustine's concept of the neighborly love is too Neoplatonic, is too Greek, and cannot capture this very peculiar nature of the sort of the Hebrew neighborly love as basically taking on everybody. Yeah.
One final. I'm going to say two things and then ask a short question. I'm puzzled by the contrast of Christianity and Judaism on the idea of the overflowingness of creation. Bonum est diffusivum sui, it's a medieval explanation. In Shaler's critique of Nietzsche, the Ressentiment, it's very clear that what you're calling the Jewish notion of love is there. Art Buchwald once said, "Dying is easy, parking is hard." And the question I have is, in Being in Time, Heidegger writes, free for its own most possibilities, those determined by the end, Dasein averts the danger of failing to recognize, on the basis of its own understanding of existence, the possibility of existence of others that are overtaking it or misinterpreting it, forcing them back to its own possibility. As a possibility that is not shared, death individualizes, but only in order, as the possibility that cannot be overtaken, to make Dasein understand that as being with, it is for the possibility of being of others. End of quote.
Well, yeah, I don't deny this. That's why I had absolutely no argument also with Brian's paper. I think that this is, as I said, Levinas's critique of Heidegger's solitary death is cliched, and in fact there is a possibility of building a communal life on the basis of death experience and this systematic overestimation of death which Heidegger proposes. But my goal was different, to show that this is not the only way in which the human being can become human. That is, death is not the only anthropogenic factor, and then that the way to a human society or communal human way of life does not have to lead through the gates of death, right? So that was my point. I don't contest the possibility of building a communal life on the basis of death of experience in Heidegger, but I'm saying it's not the only possible way, and that's not the only possible theory. The one based on love as the alternative marker or experience of human finitude is equally possible, and I would say preferable. Okay? Oh, I don't think there's actually, I think I totally agree with Jean-Luc Nancy in his essay on Heidegger from Finite Thinking, where he tells that there is no affect of love in Heidegger. The derivatives of death, there are affective derivatives of death experience, but they are not love. And this is exactly what Arendt says of Augustine. There's no love in Augustine. There are affective derivatives of death experience, but not love. Okay, so it's a bit slogan-like and probably needs elaboration, but that would be the answer to your question.